thank all of the board members and all of the volunteers and everybody that does everything to get today together. Because I'm the president, but they do all the work. And I say, oh, that sounds great. I mean, I do a little of it, but it's not like they are so invested in this community, and we really appreciate it. The volunteers coming and putting everything out, everything, Pete booking the musicians, all of it happening, and we really, really, really appreciate all the work they do. So give them a hand, please. And I would also like to thank Susan Thompson. She is the newest member of the Speakers Committee, and she has booked 2 fabulous speakers in the past month, the Ensemble Theater, and then last week's Glenn Ackerman. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We've had a great time. Okay, now as we begin, first of all, people are more important than beliefs, and human hands solve human problems. And all of our core values are very important, especially in this time. So remember those as we go out when things are problematic or whatever. Remember, people are more important than beliefs, and that we can help and take care of many things. All right, as we begin, let me do the, I'm going to go ahead and do the announcements real quickly. We are taking up ABDA donation collections to start off our secular month of action. Oasis will be collecting items for the organization Aid to Victims of Domestic Abuse, ABDA. Okay. Please bring face mask, nail polish, chapstick, mascara, foot and body scrubs, essential oils, teas, and adult coloring books and journals. And you can also donate online, and every penny will go to this, if you mark it as ABDA donation, we use it to buy supplies. And now, Jennifer, one of our board members, would you please come up and talk to us about your project?
Hey, y'all. So we have another drive going on for our secular month, week, year, I don't know, of action. So I have a cousin who has a kindergarten class in the Pasadena ISD, and we are doing a book drive for her class. She has 18 students. Our goal is to have 3 books per student, so that's 54 at least total. If we have more, everything needs to be in multiples of 18. You know how kids are if they don't get the same number as everybody else. They need books in Spanish, they need readers, books on science, picture books. These are children that literally have no books at home. This is a book desert. So we are hoping to collect these books, and then in May, before they go home for the summer, Julie will spread all these books out on the carpet, and the kids can pick some books and take them home for the summer, and they will start their own little home library. So we will have boxes in the back for books in the next several weeks, so please, if you're out and about and you see some books for kids, that would be great for kindergartners. Picture books don't have to be, they don't have to be readers. We're just something that an adult or an older sibling can read to them is fine. So we hope you'll be able to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. We had a bunch of books come in today. That was pretty exciting. Thank you so much who brought the books in. I appreciate it. On Wednesday, April 16th, there is an Oasis board meeting. If you're interested in the goings-on at Oasis, tune into the monthly board meeting. Email board@Houston Oasis to request the virtual meeting link. We will have an open session and then a closed session. Everyone is welcome to the open session. So, also we have Blues Night coming up this week. Will be a beautiful night to catch some blistering hot blues and jazz on Thursday, April 17th. Come out to hear the Mighty Orc at the Big Easy from 8:15 to 11:15 p.m. And Life and Death on the Border, 1910 to 1920. On Saturday, April 19th from 10 to 12 at the Holocaust Museum. We're going to view this timely exhibit that examines the hardships and racial violence faced by people of Mexican descent on the border between Texas and Mexico in the second decade of the 20th century. Museum members are free, adults are $22, and seniors are $16. So if you want to, all of this will be on our website, on Facebook and website, and Meetup, but just so you know. Also, there's a blood drive today. Most of you have probably seen the blood truck outside. All donors get a t-shirt, free fries at a burger joint, and pancakes from IHOP. It's a good deal. Just a pint of blood. It's a pretty good deal. All right. So for the beginning, we are going to have music by local Houston musicians who are studying at TSU, Sebastian Morales and Tari Amir. So thank you guys for being here today, and we are looking forward to listening to you play. All right, thank you so much, guys. Don't know if y'all all know, but they came in because our musician was ill today. And so they have both been playing. Thank you. They have both been playing numerous gigs recently, and so we're lucky to get them today. Thank you all very much. We will hear 2 more songs from you later on. So just to let you know how this is going to go, our speaker is going to come up and talk. Then we're going to take a coffee break. At the end of the coffee break, we're going to have a song, question and answer, and then a song, just so we all know where we are going in. So now, Bob Fisher, who has been a member of our community for years, he has spoken many times, and we're very excited that he's coming back to tell us about why did democracy arise, where and when did it, when it did, what are its roots and the conditions which nurture it, against a background of the summary of the history of democracy. He will present his findings on the topic, which he has developed as a part of his ongoing research for a book on how political systems work. Bob, come take the stage. Thank you.
Okay, you can hear me. What I'm going to talk about today is really not part of my book, but I kind of went down a rabbit hole on it for about 18 months, and so I thought I might as well present the results here, because it's pretty accepted history, but it's not well known. So let's start with some data. These are the top 30 democracies in the world. The Economist Intelligence Unit does a survey annually and rates 150 countries according to how democratic they are. The bottom of the scale is probably around 2.5 for dictatorships and things, and the top is 10. All right, so first 15, second 15, and you can see where the United States stands on this. So we'll come back to this at the end, but this is just background for where democracy is currently. So this is my definition of democracy. It's pretty vague, but democracy itself is a pretty vague concept. It's when most of the people are generally in control of the country, running their own affairs. Okay. So who knows when or where was the first democracy? Greece? Well, you know more than me because I don't think anyone knows. Greece is the earliest one that we know about, but as you go back in time, all the organic material disappears. We really have no idea how the people ran their societies, and it could be much older than that. I have some slides on it, but I took them out just because of time. We're going to cover we are going to start with Greece. And we're going to cover 2,500 years in 25 minutes, so that's 100 years a minute. So you're all seated, put your seatbelts on. All right. Actually, a Greek called, there we go. This is not working for me. Herodotus in Greece wrote about people called the Medians or Medians. who are in the area which is currently Iran, I believe. And they existed about 1000 BC. And they had democracy, but they got overrun by the Persian Empire, and so that democracy kind of disappeared. Not really connected with our democracy today. So I'm not going to talk about it, it's not part of the slides. The next couple of slides are just definitions of democracy. Put it in the context, social context. So it exists on a spectrum with dictatorship and democracies at the other end. And so you kind of see here, I think of it in terms of how concentrated the power is. So it's in one person at the left-hand end, and goes with more and more people until you get the other end, direct democracy, like the Swiss have, where everyone kind of votes on everything. So this is just a kind of slightly more detail on the same thing, looking at it in terms of votes and where the power is. So, yeah, okay. The dynamics of democracy. The natural order of society is hierarchical, pecking order. Birds have it, right? This is kind of like all social animals have this natural order, right? So democracy is unnatural. That's the first thing we need to realize. It's something we've built for ourselves. Societies build it, they create it, but it's not natural. And democracy and autocracy are always at war. Even in the most democratic societies, you have to keep the autocrats at bay. It's a constant battle, a constant fight. And so therefore, it requires ordinary people to be able to stand up to the people who have power and wealth and manage that situation, right? And that's the dynamics of the social dynamics of democracy. And the people have to do that. There are two ways to do it. They can either be armed, right? Or they can be organized. Even if you don't have arms, if you have 1 million people fighting against you, kind of just standing outside your house, you kind of, you're not going to take a gun to them, right? You can't win. And so these are just my thoughts on the prerequisites for democracy, and we'll kind of revisit this in the end. The first is common with any form of government, which is the rule of law. And then the second most important is really respect for private property. If you don't have that, you really can't have a democracy. The third is to have some way, this is stated vaguely because there are different ways of doing it, but it's some mechanism for public involvement in creating the laws. The people have to be involved in that. And lastly, but even more important almost, a mechanism for equitable resolution of personal disputes, which is the courts. You have to have a court system. Having the laws and no courts to administer it and make sure it works, doesn't work. And there's a question mark over whether or not being organized nationally, having big institutions is necessary for a democracy or not. It kind of depends on how you define democracy. Okay, so who knows, who thinks they know, which is the world's oldest democracy? Oldest not meaning back in time, but longest lived democracy. Any suggestions? No. No. Okay. The Isle of Man has over 1,000 years of continuous, uninterrupted democratic self-rule. Okay? Who knows where the Isle of Man is? All right, quite a few people. All right, it's a little island in the middle of the Irish Sea in the UK. It's a protectorate, so it's kind of like part of the UK, but it has its own money, it has its own government, doesn't have its own army, right? It's known as, it's a tax haven, and it's known for its motorcycle racing, which I've been there several times to watch the motorcycle racing. And this is their parliament, their original parliament. This little hill here is called Tynwald, which is a corruption of the original Tingwold. Wold is Old English for hill, just means hill. So, and Ting, we'll come to it later, thing is the old Parliament, right? So this is Parliament Hill. And you can see, of course, the church got into the act later on. But the Parliament still meets there ceremonially, annually, you know. So let's go back to Greece, start there. We'll cover Greece and Rome very quickly because they're not very relevant. This is a timeline down the bottom. And these are other civilizations that I have slides for, but we're not going to talk about, that possibly influenced the Greek. First, we'll start with Draco. Draco lived about 100 years before the traditional start of Greek democracy, right? But it really starts with him because he was the guy who first wrote down the laws in Greece, right? Before that, it was oral, right? It was sheriff decided what was going to happen in town, right? But he wrote down all the laws and kind of organized the system, but he wanted to make sure it stuck, and so his punishment for everything was death. You know, you stole something, you died, right? And that's what he's known for, draconian punishment, right? We still remember it. The next guy, about 50 years later, was Solon. And people were getting fed up of all this draconian punishment. And so Solon moderated all these punishments and also put in some laws to make it more easy for people to move up the social ladder, right? Which is also something that's necessary for democracy, right? And so then there was a period, this is at this time, it was fluctuating between democracy, and then they would have a tyrant, and they would get the power back, you know. So, so about 70 years later, we get Cleisthenes, and he had been in power. He'd been, I think, the administrator for a year, and he had promised. He promised that he would introduce democracy, but then he got thrown out. He got ostracized and had to go out of the country for 10 years. And when he came back, he came back because they'd just thrown out a tyrant, and they wanted to put democracy back in place. And so they invited him to come and do something. And so this is what he did. He really completely reorganized the whole thing. He broke the country up into 10 regions, increased the boule, which is like the council, from 400 to 500 people, probably just for arithmetic, 50 people per each of these regions, representatives. He introduced sortition, which is where the people in the council, the boule, they were just picked at random from the population, right? You know, completely random, right? This was to avoid corruption, right? And the way it worked is that the boule came up with the laws, and then more or less weekly, all the voters came and they voted on the laws. So it was both kind of, it was direct democracy, right, with everyone voting on every law. But the voters were only the adult males with Athenian parents, right, which is about 20 to 30% of the population. So in that sense, not very democratic. And the Athenian Empire lasted for about 180 years, and it grew to be all this gold area. It didn't survive because of the Persian Empire, which they were constantly fighting, and Macedonia to the north with Alexander the Great. That became a big empire, and Greece was kind of swallowed up in that. Alexander the Great actually kind of had a lot of respect for the Greek democracy, and he kind of left them alone. He didn't conquer them, but he kind of suppressed the growth of Greece and their culture. Okay, so in Rome, Rome was very connected to Greece. Roman democracy was about 50 years behind Greek democracy, and the Romans actually copied a lot of stuff from the Greece. I'm saying here that Roman democracy is Tweedian, meaning Tweedism is where the people have a vote, but someone in the shadows is choosing all the people they vote for, right? So that's the way Roman democracy was, basically. The Roman Republic, which is the real democratic part, was only for the first 50, 60 years, something like that. And after that, it slowly became more and more corrupt until you get the Roman Empire, right? It only took 24 years for access to power by the citizens to start to be restricted. Before that, anyone could be like the chief magistrate, but after that, it started to be restricted to the elites. In 450, which is about 50 years after it began, they actually sent a delegation to Greece to see how Greek democracy was working, and they came back and they created these 12 tables, which was the first non-religious outline of common law so that was a separation of church and state in Rome. So they did, put that into the history books. And slowly, access to power by citizens improved over the centuries just due to upward mobility. So this wasn't a case of ordinary citizens being access to power, but ordinary citizens had the ability to earn money and become part of the elite, and then they had access to power. That's the way it worked in Rome. So the Roman Empire collapsed, and of course it was so powerful, when it collapsed, it initiated a lot of movement around Europe, everywhere. I mean, you see Carthage just kind of exploded because it was in its own right a really vibrant civilization, and it was under Rome's thumb. And so, once the Roman influence disappeared, they went everywhere. But we're going to look up at the north here at what was happening in Northern Europe. In England, the Romans departed in around the end of the 5th century, around 400, possibly up to 500. It was a slow withdrawal over a fairly long period of time. And when the Roman Empire collapsed, the generals, their control of the generals out there in the provinces kind of collapsed as well, and they were doing their own thing just to protect their troops, really. And so it was a bit of a mess. But the British population had been suppressed under Roman rule for 3 centuries. It's a long time. No one remembered anything else except Roman rule, and they didn't have any infrastructure, societal infrastructure, when the Romans withdrew because the Romans had been running everything. And so the economy collapsed. Everything reverted to subsistence agriculture for close to 100 years, right? They stopped making pottery. It was just, everything was just back to basics. People were just trying to feed themselves. However, the country was underpopulated, had a lot of virgin land, a lot of open wild forests, and there's a political vacuum. No local kings or anything when the Romans disappeared. And the ordinary people at this time, everyone spoke Celtic. That was the language of the farmers. And so, because of this political vacuum, there was, over several hundred years, waves of immigration, gradual immigration from the near Scandinavian countries. And as you know, the British is referred to as Anglo-Saxons because a lot of the people came from these Angles from here and from Saxons. Sometimes this is drawn as up here. These were different tribes that lived in different places at different times. But anyway, generally people came from that area, and they moved down the coast, and many of them came across to England and settled there. So there was no evidence of it actually being like a Viking invasion. It was relatively peaceful settlement, so far as we know. The Celtic language disappeared, and it became Norse. There's some Celtic remains, but 5-7%, something like that. So Old English is Norse. It's a dialect of what they speak in Norway and Denmark, etc. Right? The DNA evidence is mixed, but it's hard. The DNA is hard because these populations here and here and here are not dissimilar, right? So when you're trying to figure out how many people from here came to here when the population, the DNA is quite similar, is difficult. There's a lot of variance in the unknowns. But we do know that there's no Norse DNA here in Wales. They didn't come into Wales. They pushed the Celts back here into the mountains of Wales, and that's still very Celtic. And the language is very Celtic. That Welsh is the Celtic language. The migration drivers, besides the economic opportunity of going to a country that had just been vacated and had lots of land, the tradition in the Norse society was that the eldest son got the farm. And so the younger sons had to go off, find somewhere else to live. And so that was another driver for immigration. Another point was that, of course, there's constant, this is tribal, right? So there's wars going on all over the place. And the Danes invaded, the Danes from this part of Denmark, which this wasn't Denmark in those days. So the tribe here invaded the Jutland Peninsula and basically drove out Angles and Saxons, and who came across the sea, and the Saxons were driven southward into northern Germany, and of course this part of Germany is now called Saxony. So during this period, 500 to 750, it's called the Merovingian Scandinavia, because the area to the south in Germany was the Merovingian period on the continent. And they weren't bothering the Scandinavians. And so the Scandinavians during this period were doing their own thing as a bunch of tribes. They still had no written language. They had runes, but they were just used for public labels. Something that you're going to put up that's going to last for hundreds of years. Levying a house or a gravestone or something like that. So they had oral histories to preserve the ancestry and the customs. In the east, up here in the East Baltic, this is where the pirates lived. So these people kind of self-organized, and they had a reasonably peaceful life. But here was like Badlands, and you can see where the pirates are. It's current Russia. I mean, the culture hasn't changed very much. And in Merovingian Scandinavia, maybe just after this period, there was a continuous development. The kings got more and more ambitious, and there was more and more fighting, and the kingdoms got bigger and bigger. That process was just happening over the centuries. So let's talk about Norse society and law. They were basically farmers, but they had a warrior culture. Every adult male was trained in martial arts and could defend himself, and of course we all know they knew how to sail. That land up there is mountainous in the middle, farmland around the edge, so they lived on the borders of the sea, and they sailed everywhere, around the Baltic and around the coast. That's how they got around. So good sailors, farmers, warriors. The army was the people. The kings didn't have an army, right? If the king wanted to go to war, he had to persuade everyone. It was a good idea to go to war, and then everyone got together, eldest son and parents and father, and off they went to war. So the power was bottom up. A jarl, which in English became an earl, ruled with the consent of his freemen, and the king ruled with the consent of the jarls. It was a bottom up democratic system. They worked out everything, any disputes in what they called things, which were a people's court. where everyone just gathered around and there was a speaker and they had processes for it, all oral, nothing written down. And they worked out, there was a court, people would be, for disputes and everything else. So women in the society had status and power. The women had the keys to the farm and took care of all the business. They voted on behalf of an absent husband. They could initiate a divorce. They were also to some degree, second-class citizens, but they also had a lot of rights, right? So they weren't full equals, but respected. And the society did have slaves. Everyone at that time had slaves, right? They were slave traders, right? So this is not a nice, genteel society, but they have their laws. So at the beginning of the Viking Age, I don't spend too much time on this. There's a story behind this. I'll tell it if you want during the questions. But basically, the thing here is that the first king of Denmark had a Viking grandfather from the East Baltic, a genuine Viking pirate king with his own fleet of ships, married into the family, and his grandson eventually became the first king of Denmark, 50 years before the beginning of the Viking Age. All right, connect the dots there, right? Just point of reference. So what was happening to the south at that time in Europe is that Charlemagne this is Charlemagne's empire in blue, and he was very expansionist. This is a map of how he was expanding his territory and the dates that he conquered places. So in 734, he started to pillage Frisia. Frisia is up here in this little corner. It's now part of Holland. And in 737, work started on the Danevirk here, which is a defensive wall that goes all the way across the bottom of the Jutland Peninsula, right? Because they knew what was coming. They weren't at war at that point, but they could see it coming, and so they started building, the Danevirk. And he invaded Saxony, then he conquered Frisia. Then 792, Offa, who was the king of England at the time, contacted Rome. There are very few, I've seen references to that, but I haven't been able to track them down. So I put a question mark because I don't have the details of that. It's a little blurry. But in 793, there was the first Lindisfarne, the first Viking raid on Lindisfarne in the UK, on the Northumberland coast. And in 795, Offa made a treaty with Charlemagne. So probably he was already talking to Charlemagne at that time. So the point here is that the first Viking raid was exactly at the time when the UK was getting involved in Charlemagne and getting involved in Europe and talking to Rome. The Charlemagne and the Roman Church were like this. I mean, they were together, right? It was a joint assault. And the Scandinavians, when Charlemagne took over a Scandinavian place, he destroyed the religion and the politics at the same time, right? So he was putting an autocratic regime on top of a democratic one. So in the Viking Age, there was initial military response but it turned into they found it was profitable, and so they carried on. And for another century and a half, they were just going around raiding because they had the technology, they had fast ships, they could get away with it. But eventually they started settling. And they went everywhere. They went to Ireland, they went all around the north of Scotland, and no one liked them. So it was a big problem, right, for a couple of hundred years. But this behavior was actually not typical of the general Norse population, who, as I say, were basically farmers. And they weren't all out in these boats. I mean, there was a tiny percentage who were doing the raiding. And the numbers that settled during this time, towards the end of that 250 years, they're thought to be a lot less than the Anglo-Saxon settlement. The Anglo-Saxon settlement was massive. It can swamp the existing population. But this was a much, much smaller settlement. So the reason that we know everything about the Norse, even though they had this oral tradition, is through the sagas. And that gets us to Iceland, so we'll talk about Iceland for a second. During 850 to 900, which is towards the end of the Viking raiding period, there was a big migration to Iceland. There was no one living there at the time, and they populated the country in about 50 years, 60,000 people. And they came, according to the genetics, which is down the bottom corner, they came from 1/3 of them. There's no one there, so that you wouldn't get single men going, right? It was all couples, families, right? And so about 1/3 of them came from Norway, and the other 2/3 came from Ireland and Scotland. That's what the genetics shows us that populated Iceland originally. What did they do when they got there? Well, within 70 or 80 years, they created their own parliament with no king. And then about 100 years after that, they started to document. They become Christian. It's kind of ironic. They become Christian at this time, and because they became Christian, they learned to write and read. And once they learned to write and read, they could write down the sagas. And so they documented all their sagas that they remembered ancestrally. And so that's where we know a lot of Norse knowledge comes from, is from those sagas. This is in Iceland. It's Thingvellir. It's their historical parliament. I took this picture in August 2022, and it was a pilgrimage for me. So that speaker's rock here, this rock, this is the rock where the speaker stood. So you're looking at 1,000 years, another 1,000 years of parliamentary history here. It's not, in the case of Iceland, it's not unbroken, because they had a couple of periods where, they were part of a larger country, Denmark, and I think Norway before that. So it's not unbroken self-government, but they've, again, 1,000 years of parliamentary history here. And the Icelandic parliament still ceremonially, just like the Isle of Man, meets here once a year to keep the spirit alive. So back into the UK, that settlement of the Vikings created what became known as the Danelaw. And this map, those dots, represent place names, villages, towns that are Norse, right? So you can see from the data where the Norse settled. And it was in the east, in East Anglia here, and all up the coast here, and then the north of England, across the north of England. And I know, because I come from the north of England, it's very Norse. I mean, there's the place, the names of the streets, the names of the way we call little alleys and giggle-gaggles and things, they're all Norse names. I grew up in the next farm. 5 minutes, okay. All right, I'm going to go faster. The Vikings settled in France as well, in Normandy. We know that. This map is also showing the density of Norse place names. So you can see that. Norman rule, Norman the Conqueror from Normandy invaded 1066 and imposed a feudal system which was brutal. Started the Doomsday Book, collected taxes from everyone, harried the people in the north, because there were a lot more free people in the north, and reduced them to serfs, brought the church under his rule, bequeathed England to his youngest son, Normandy to his eldest son, Robert. William went to war against Robert and acquired Normandy. But William wasn't very popular, and the middle son, Henry, arranged an assassination and took over the throne in 1100 as Henry I, right? So this is kind of interesting, because 1100 is 34 years after the invasion in 1066. And in 1100, the same year as his coronation, Henry married a Scottish princess, right? Scottish being Norse, right? And so it was a Norse custom to marry your daughter to the neighboring king. And at the request of his bride, he issued the Charter of Liberties, which was traditional Norse law. So in 34 years, they had put back into English law the Norse law, that was taken away in the Norman conquest 34 years earlier. And Henry's a good king. He influenced a bunch of courts and, system of law and everything. And for the next 100 years, multiple kings take the throne, and all of them sign on to this Charter of Liberties. They say, yeah, that's a good thing, we'll uphold it, until King John takes the throne in 1199. And here we get the Magna Carta. So King John signed the Magna Carta in Runnymede Meadow, and it's important because it's the first time that in English law, the monarch and the government was said to be not above the law. The law applies to everyone. This was the first time it was kind of written down. That's why it's famous. But the rebellion of the English barons that led to this, it was from the north. And this book, this is a quote from this book, a few weeks after the nobles demanded that the laws of Hereford be observed, another assembly met in London. Stephen Langton, who was the cleric, told the meeting, I've lately found the Charter of Henry I, by which liberties we have long lost may be restored to your account. He read and explained it to them, and then one of the barons said, for these rights, when the proper season shall come, we will die. Swear it, said Langton, and they all swore it. So this is a connection between the Magna Carta and the Charter of Liberties over 100 years earlier, right? It was the basis for it. It was already there. Then there was the paper internet came with the printing press. Elizabethan England, formal schooling, new technology, helps people to become educated, start to organize. There's a lot of turbulence in the 17th century. Civil War, 50 years of Civil War. Won't go through all the history here. There's a great play. A lot of things happened. Charles II died suddenly, and James, his younger brother, succeeded Charles, but he was Catholic, meaning associated with France, and almost immediately started to rule autocratically. And then something really important happened. We had what's called the Glorious Revolution. So William and Mary from Holland were invited to come and jointly rule. And the Bill of Rights was drawn up by Parliament. At this time, as a reference point, voting is still only by about 5% of males in the UK. So the legal changes that happened in the Glorious Revolution were, all these, you can read them. It was the first time in law it became a constitutional monarchy. Law applied to everyone, private property. All the commercial aspects of the society were standardized. And the thing is that William had already done all this. It was already present in Holland. Holland were almost 100 years ahead of the UK legally in this. And so when he came, he was able to just, boom, put all this in place. It was a big liberalization. 1700, the Scottish Parliament was folded back into the English one, which was like a step backwards. Everyone was focused on making money in the 1700s, right? So there wasn't a lot of focus on democracy and making the world a better place from that perspective. So there were, the next 100 years, there were incremental changes in the law in the UK, and eventually by 1928, there was universal suffrage, everyone could vote. In 1918, it was just single women were given the vote, but not married women. Well, why that? Well, it's because in the Norse times, the vote was with a household, and that was still in people's heads, right? So this is the influence that Norse democracy had in Northern Europe. You don't need to look at all the arrows. And because the British Empire and the influence that it had, the UK exported it to a bunch of other countries as well. And so if we go back and look at that original list, that last column is mine, and I've marked which democracies out of the top 30 are directly the result of Norse democracy. And the ones in green are where the country was secondarily influenced by being populated by an original Norse democracy. You know, New Zealand, Ireland, Australia, all, you know, British people settling there, Canada, right? Where it says 19th, 20th century, that's, at that point, countries would become democratic. There's lots of democracy around. People just looked at what other people were doing and created it. It wasn't a direct influence of one country. It was just an opportunity after throwing a dictator out or whatever. So you can see the overwhelming influence of the Norse on the better democracies of the world. I'll put this slide up again at the end so you can study it. Women's voting rights through the ages, well, important, but we'll skip over it. And this is a summary of everything that we've just gone through. And the point I wanted to make here is that from the Romans departing and the Norse coming in through to full adult suffrage, 1,500 years to get there. It's a long path. And that wasn't the beginning. When the Norse came in, they brought their democracy with them. They'd already spent time developing that internal to the Norse. So the process of democratic development is a long one. Okay. So these are just my thoughts on what's prerequisites for democracy. The populace has to be able to project power, has to have some kind of leverage. It takes a lot of time for the social change to happen. It's usually triggered either by abject poverty causing a revolution or by a good level of prosperity and a slow evolution, a slow increase in the influence of the people. And very important, I think, a tradition to personal freedom. I think tradition is really important because those traditions live a long time in the society. You know, governments come in and they tell the people what to do, but the governments have no control of what parents tell their children around the kitchen table. And that just goes generationally. It just keeps going and keeps going. And these things are important, they help, but I'm not convinced that they're a prerequisite. And there's a lot of luck involved. This is a very random process. It can be swamped by a bad neighbor, all that kind of stuff, you know, so, yeah. There's some recommended reading here. I didn't want to give you a lot of stuff, but this, unfortunately, is Kindle only, and it's written by, this is a Norwegian guy, and this is a really good, so it's not, everything I have is not in here, but, so this is on the Viking legacy. This book here was a New York Times bestseller a little over 10 years ago, and it ties together economics and politics and shows the interaction between them. And it's a definitive work. Those two guys, plus one other economist, got the Nobel Prize for Economics last year. So, and it's not an easy read, but it's a worthy read. Okay, so I'll leave this up. You can look at it. And we'll, yeah.
We really appreciate your insights. Is this on? Is this not on? Is it on now? I am a theater teacher. It's not a problem. All right. And so before we go to our coffee break, I just wanted to say a couple of things. Next week is our board game and social week where we're going to come up here and play board games and be social and have a nice time. It's a place for you to go on Easter Sunday. Everybody's welcome. We are going to go to Tarka Indian afterwards, but you're welcome to bring snacks for our board game time, board game snacks. The last blood donation is 12:45. If anybody's interested in still doing that, that's the last time you can go over there, and probably a little before that. That would be great. And just to remind you that free thought isn't free. Please donate if you can. Please continue coming if that's not an option for you right now. We want you here, If you can help support what we're doing here, that's awesome. But you are always welcome, just so you know that. And so right now, we're gonna go to a coffee break, then we're going to have 2 songs, and then Bob is gonna stay for lunch. And if anybody has any questions they want to ask him, they can ask them then and probably get, you can sit around the table with him and whatever, ask him some questions, okay? So 10-minute coffee break, we'll be back, more music, and then we will set up for lunch, okay? Thank you. Yay. Whenever you're ready. Y'all can start whenever you're ready. They'll get in here. The music will call them in. It will be like a... I just thought of something, gentlemen, since y'all need to kind of go. Would you like to play your last song now? And then you guys can head out for your gigs for the afternoon. All right, we're going to play their last song, and then you can have the floor. That'll be good. Okay. Thank you so much. Susan has a question.
I wanted to congratulate our musicians for coming up with a follow-up to Bob's talk. He's talked about all these different kinds of rulers through many, many centuries, and including autocrats. And then the band comes up with Someday My Prince Will Come.
Very nice choice. Very nice. Anyway, thank you guys so much. Please contact Pete. Come play for us again. We loved it. Come. All right. Anyway, take care. All right. Yay. All right. I should know how to do this. It's all stuck in there. All right, Bob, you have the stage now, and I will walk around if you have any questions. We are waiting for pizza to be delivered, so have fun. Is it ready?
Yes? No, it's working. Okay, all right. So, before I take the first question, I need to tell you something. I flunked out of history in 8th grade, so do not ask me about dates of kings and queens.
I have a microphone.
Oh, okay.
Okay. In general, could you give us an idea of some of the kinds of sources that you used for your huge array of topics and a huge array of information there? But it's...
Well, obviously, you kind of start with the internet. But I bought, I went, this is very peripheral to the book that I'm kind of working on. It's really not part of it. It might end up being maybe part of a chapter at the beginning for some added interest. But I kind of I was interested in it myself, and I went down a rabbit hole on it for about 18 months. And I have about 2 feet of books on the Anglo-Saxons and the North, the Norse, right? In fact, I brought some of them here. These are just 4 books which are specifically on the legal aspects. Anglo-Saxon democracy, the Anglo-Saxon state, Viking law and order, and this one that was on this title, this Viking laws and the Magna Charta. This book is kind of rare. It's only in one edition, about 70 years ago, by a lady who was American actually, but she was of Nordic ancestry. And she did a PhD thesis on it. She studied in the Bodleian Library in Oxford and looked at the original documents. And then after the PhD thesis, she wrote this book. And if you can find an actual copy, they run around $200. I got this one for 70, I think. Found it somewhere. But yeah, it's kind of a rare book. And this was the book that tied together the Charter of Liberties and the Magna Carta. It made that link. I think she's the only person who's written about it.
Bob, at the beginning, you mentioned there was a little bit of a composite between plutocracy and democracy. And of course, this is true today here. What's your opinion? Is plutocracy going to prevail, or is democracy going to prevail in this country right now?
Well, someone asked me kind of a related question to that at the break. You know, the American psyche is very oriented towards me and individualism, and not very oriented towards society, you know? And so, you know, maybe plutocracy is the best it can do. I don't know. You know, I think the main point is the one I made at the end. This is a long road. You know, and you look at what happened in the UK, and it increased, and then for 50 years it went back, you know, with a bad king, and then it went better, and then it went back. The only good thing that I can say is that there does seem to be a pattern that after a bad thing happening, you get a great leap forward. So in that sense, you know, maybe I'm optimistic about the next 50 years.
The by-elections are coming.
Yeah. So, yeah. Question?
Yeah. Hey, Bob. Thanks for talking. So I had a kind of a question about like when we hear talks about democracy and the origins of democracy a lot, we hear about Europe and then how it comes to America, and we kind of have this trope that like maybe America perfected it or something, but it stays like kind of a European story and then maybe an American story, and then are we? Is that off? Is that better? It usually is like a European and American story. Do you think we like? It was turned down. So usually it's like a European and American story. Do you think we like lack information on a lot of other parts in the world and like maybe places where democracy has sprouted up, like originally on its own elsewhere, or is it fairly uniquely, you know, Greek, Roman, Norse, that kind of thing?
I mean, when we talk about, you know, like Greek and Roman and modern democracies, we're talking about democracies in big developed countries, right? I mean, Greece, big developed nation for the time, right? Actually, democracy exists in a lot of places. It exists in a lot of native societies. You know, if you have conditions where people aren't suffering, okay, they will mostly work together democratically. You know, they get along and they organize themselves and they get on with their neighbors, and right. It's when you get the problems come when you put people together and you have stressors, right? So you have winters come when there's no food, and so people potentially are fighting over the food. You have to have organization to manage that and have people able to eat during the winter. And then you have people who take advantage of that and, you know, dominate it. And you have kings coming up. Yeah.
Yeah, how much do you think that democracy is driven by just going after one's own self-interest and not trying to find out what's best for everybody, but when you seek power for yourself, that democracy is what emerges from that?
Ooh, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that. I think democracy, well, yeah, democracy has to start with tolerance. Okay, that's the fundamental of democracy. But it's more than tolerance, because the Chinese have tolerance. The Chinese are taught to tolerate other people, right, and not fight them. But the Chinese have no concept of democracy because they don't have a concept of being part of a wider society. Only as nationalists, you know.
Or is it that they fail to seek power for themselves?
They fail.
Or is it that they fail to seek power for self? That's why they
No, the Chinese do seek power for self. I mean, they're very self-oriented. I mean, most, yeah, I'm not dissing Chinese, but, you know, yeah, I mean, yeah, we won't go into dissing
right.
particular countries here.
Susan? Can I do another one? Sure. Go for it. You mentioned
two kind of related things. One of them was way back, one of those societies met every week to work things out.
Greece.
It's really hard for me to imagine. Weekly meeting, even monthly meetings are really difficult. And the other question, but part of that is Switzerland. You alluded to Switzerland. I hardly ever see Switzerland in the news, so
Switzerland is very interesting, okay? I didn't have time to tell you the story on that, but I thought for a long time that Swiss democracy had kind of started by itself. It got separate from, there didn't seem to be a connection with the Norse. Until I came across, it's Wikipedia actually, and there was a Swiss writer around 450, something like that, AD. And he was writing about the Swiss origin myths, okay? And a lot of myths we call them myths because there's nothing to support them historically, but they're quite often true, based in truth. And the Swiss origin myth is that there were a bunch of Swedes from Sweden came up the river looking for a new home, migrating, during the migration period, a few hundred years earlier, and settled in Switzerland. Right? And if you doubt that the truth of that story, you just have to look at the Middle German name for Sweden. The Middle German name for Sweden is Switzer. Switzerland is actually Swedenland. It's right there in the name.
Wow. All right, any more questions? Okay. I'm so slow, sorry.
Yeah, the mic's coming.
I'm
yeah.
coming. That's why I wanted you to have the mic. You know how slow I am. Here you go.
You mentioned these cultures had slaves. I don't know how many of them did, but do you know any idea as to how somebody became a slave? Could somebody choose to be a slave because they just didn't have other options, or were they forced into it? Or
At that time until not very long ago, it's only 200 years ago, something like that, since slavery was abolished, maybe 300. Yeah, it was just normal to have slaves. I mean, it was a hierarchical society with, an elite and ordinary people and people on the verge of starving and slaves. I mean, it's just the way it was. And the Norse actually, for millennia, right? The Norse culture goes back to, at least back to 1500 BC, when they were trading, slave trade, and trading other things with the Byzantine Empire. With the Persians, down in the area of Turkey. And they had contacts with the Greece, which is what the slides I was missing, right? They knew all about Greece, they exported amber to Greece, and they imported stuff. So they were aware of Greek ideas. But I really don't think that the Greek ideas are the basis of Norse. I think that's deeper. It's something. The Norse democracy comes not from ideology, but from academic ideology, but from their sense of being independent and yet cooperative with their fellow people. Yeah.
All right, well, okay, the pizza's here now.
Yeah.
How does theology or religion fit in with democracy?
Theology.
Yeah, theology, religion, how does that?
Well, for the Norse, it was they're separate things. I mean, because they had their pantheon of gods. I mean, they were heathens, by our definition. Religion comes into it when you get organized religion, right? Religion, in Central Europe during the time that all this was happening, religion was really closely tied with the politics. From the Carolingian Empire onwards, the Roman Catholic Church was in bed with all the powerful kings, and it was followed, of course, by the Holy Roman Empire after Rome fell. So the church was always involved there, looking for power by alliances with the kings. But that's organized religion. I mean, philosophically, I think the two are kind of disconnected.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for sharing that with us. He will be here today for lunch. Yay. If everybody will help us set up for lunch, we usually put 3 or 4 tables, chairs around it, and then stack the others no higher than 5 high over there, and we can get the food out and get started with socializing.